Imagine waking in the early hours of the morning. The house is completely quiet. Dawn is only beginning to filter through the windows, casting long, familiar shadows across the bedroom. You turn your head and see your spouse standing near the doorway. You recognize the shape of their jaw, the color of their eyes, the way they hold their shoulders when they are tired. They look exactly as they should. They know your name. They remember your children. They remember the conversations you had yesterday. But something is missing. It is not a small doubt that passes after a second glance. It is an overwhelming feeling of disconnection. You're looking at the face of the person with whom you built your life. Yet you feel certain that the individual standing in front of you is an impostor, a copy, someone or something wearing a familiar face. This is not a ghost story. It is not evidence of a supernatural replacement. It is a documented and deeply complex clinical experience in which a familiar person may suddenly feel like a stranger. In 2014, researchers described the case of a man identified as patient JH. He was 79 years old and had been diagnosed with dementia with Lewy bodies, and had been married to his wife for 28 years. JH could see that the woman standing before him looked like his wife, but he believed she was a replica. This was not ordinary forgetfulness, nor was it simply an inability to recognize her face. The belief persisted despite reassurance and evidence to the contrary. JH searched for what he believed was his real spouse. At one point, he turned to his son and asked how he could be certain that the woman was truly his mother. For JH and his family, this was not an entertaining mystery. It was confusion, distress, and loss. Welcome to the Elias Hart Chronicles. Today we are investigating one of the most unsettling questions about human perception. Why can someone you love look exactly right and still feel like a stranger? To understand that question, we need to explore how recognition and familiarity work together. But first, we must look backward. Long before neuroscience, people were already telling stories about stolen faces, supernatural substitutes, and doubles that should not exist. The fear of losing control over your own identity is ancient. Across mythology and theater, people imagined beings capable of borrowing human forms and using them as disguises. These were not yet called doppelgangers. That word would not appear until much later. They were gods, tricksters, and supernatural impersonators. One of the clearest examples appears in the Roman comedy Amphitryon. In the story, the god Jupiter takes the exact appearance of a mortal general named Amphitryon. Jupiter uses the disguise to deceive Amphitryon's wife, Alcmena. Meanwhile, Mercury disguises himself as Amphitryon's servant, Socia. When the real Socia returns, he discovers another Socia already standing outside the house. The false servant knows his appearance and his history. He claims the real Socia's name and place in the household. Then, just to make an already difficult identity crisis worse, Mercury beats him. Apparently, the gods did not believe in gentle philosophical discussion. The encounter forces Socia to question something that should have been impossible to doubt: his own identity. If another person has his face, his memories, and his place in the world, what proof does he have that he is still himself? Okay, a little side comment from not included in the script. I can just kind of imagine this guy having a stoner moment going like, "Dude, are you me? Or am I me?" Anyway, back to the script. Stories involving doubles and altered forms also appear in other ancient literary and mythological traditions. But these examples should not be collapsed into a single universal belief. A god adopting a disguise is not the same thing as a death omen, a fairy substitute, or a psychological double. What connects them is a shared vulnerability. A face is supposed to prove identity, but in these stories, it does not. Someone can take your appearance, enter your home, and speak in your voice. Your identity becomes something another being can put on like clothing. Elsewhere, the fear of replacement appeared in a more intimate form. Not in a palace occupied by deceptive gods, but inside the home and family. In Irish folklore, the landscape was sometimes understood as being shared with the she, powerful beings commonly translated into English as fairies. But these were not the delicate, friendly creatures found in modern children's stories. They belonged to a parallel supernatural society that could be respected, feared, and carefully avoided. Among the dangers associated with them was the belief that they could take a human being. The person might be carried into the fairy realm, but the bed would not necessarily be left empty. In their place, the fairies could leave a substitute, something called a changeling. The changeling was not always a perfect physical copy. In some accounts, the substitute was described as sickly, frail, contrary, or visibly unlike the person who had supposedly been taken. It occupied the missing person's place without completely matching them. This produces a different kind of horror from the divine disguise. Jupiter's deception works because his copy is perfect. The changeling is disturbing because it is not. The person in the bed is familiar enough to occupy the role of a child, spouse, or relative, but different enough that the family feels something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. A story recorded by the 19th century collector Jeremiah Curtin was associated with Rahinan Castle in County Kerry. The castle had been built upon an older earthen ringfort, the kind of location that could become closely connected with stories of the supernatural landscape. According to the tale, a woman was taken after the death of her own infant. She was brought to the castle ruins and forced to serve as a wet nurse for a fairy child. Later, she was moved to another nearby ringfort. But back in her home, something had been left in her place. Her family found a sickly woman with a swollen foot lying in her bed. Believing the substitute to be their missing relative, they cared for her until she died roughly a year later. The story does not give us a flawless duplicate plotting to steal a life. It gives us a family caring for someone who looks and behaves as though something essential has changed. We should be careful not to assign modern diagnoses to people in old folklore accounts. We cannot look backward and confidently decide that one story described dementia, another described postpartum depression, and another described a particular disability. The sources we have do not allow that certainty. But these stories may have provided a cultural framework for understanding sudden illness, disability, behavioral change, and loss. When someone familiar changed in a way the community could not explain, the idea of a substitute offered one possible answer. The person you knew had been taken. The one who remained was not truly them. It is a deeply tragic form of replacement horror. Not because the substitute is a perfect copy, but because love, memory, and grief remain attached to the place where the missing person used to be. The changeling tradition focused on the fear that someone else had been taken. Another tradition imagined a double that did not occupy your bed or steal your place. It merely appeared. And sometimes, seeing it meant that your life was nearly over. It was called the fetch. In Irish and British folklore, the fetch was described as an apparition of a living person, an immaterial double that could appear before the death of the individual it resembled. It was not a physical substitute like a changeling. It did not take your place. It functioned as an omen. 19th century writers John and Michael Bainham recorded an unusual belief about the fetch. Its meaning depended on the time of day it appeared. A fetch seen in the morning could be interpreted as a sign of long life. Seen in the evening, though, it could warn that death was approaching. Some accounts held that seeing the fetch of a relative warned of that person's death. Of course, seeing your own double was even more unsettling. It suggested that your own time might be coming to an end. The horror of the fetch is quiet. It does not attack. It does not need to speak. Imagine seeing your own shape standing across a field at dusk. It turns toward you. You recognize your own posture, your clothes, and your face. Then it disappears. Much later, the poet Ciaran Carson used the fetch in his own literary treatment of the tradition. In Carson's poetic vision, the double casts no reflection in a mirror. That missing reflection should not be presented as a universal ancient rule. It belongs specifically to a later artistic interpretation. But it is an effective image. A copy of you that can be seen, yet does not fully belong to the physical world. The fetch and the literary doppelganger are not the same tradition, and one should not be described as directly evolving into the other. Separately, late 18th century German literature developed another type of double. One concerned less with predicting death and more with the divided self. The German novelist Jean-Paul Richter introduced the word doppelganger. Literally, the double-goer in his novel Siebenkas. Writers increasingly used the double to explore guilt, identity, conscience, and the parts of ourselves we would prefer not to acknowledge. Edgar Allan Poe developed this idea in his 1839 story, William Wilson. Its narrator attends a gloomy school where he meets another boy with the same name, the same birthday, and an appearance almost identical to his own. The second William Wilson even imitates his voice, although he can speak only in a low whisper. As the narrator grows older, he embraces gambling, deception, and cruelty. But wherever he goes, his double eventually appears. The second Wilson exposes his schemes and prevents him from carrying out his worst plans. To the narrator, this figure becomes an unbearable enemy. To the reader, however, he begins to resemble something else, a conscience given human form. Eventually, Wilson corners his double and attacks him. But after the stabbing, he looks up and sees what appears to be his own wounded reflection. In destroying the figure who opposed him, he has destroyed the part of himself capable of opposition. Poe's double is not a fairy substitute. It's not a god wearing a disguise. It's not a clinical description of Capgras. It is a literary mirror. The monster is the self that knows what we have done. Literature used doubles to turn the fear inward. Modern clinical research reveals a very different reality. A person can look at someone familiar and sincerely experience them as an impostor. To understand how that might happen, we need to examine the difference between recognizing a face and feeling that the face belongs to someone we know. Capgras delusion can occur alongside several psychiatric illnesses and neurological conditions, including schizophrenia, dementia with Lewy bodies, and some forms of brain injury. It does not have one simple cause, and no single model explains every case. But one influential explanation begins with the way we recognize familiar faces. For simplicity, imagine that recognition involves two forms of information arriving together. The first part is visual. Your brain notices the eyes, the mouth, and the shape of the face. It uses those details to work out who you are looking at. But recognizing someone is more than matching a face to a memory. A familiar face can also trigger an automatic response in the body. Researchers can measure part of that response through tiny changes in sweating known as skin conductance. For the sake of narration, we can picture this as a quiet feeling of familiarity, an inner signal that says, I know this person. That description is only a metaphor. It is not a formal medical term. It represents the quiet signal that says, this person belongs in my world. I know them. I've seen this face many times over. Researchers studying a different condition, prosopagnosia or face blindness, noticed something interesting. A person with prosopagnosia may be unable to consciously identify a familiar face, yet their body can still show an automatic response to it. They cannot tell you whose face they are seeing, but some part of the recognition system may still react differently to familiar and unfamiliar people. Researchers proposed that Capgras might sometimes resemble a reversed pattern. A person may consciously see that a face matches someone they know, but the expected automatic familiarity response may be reduced. The face appears correct. The feeling does not arrive as expected. Imagine the contradiction this could create. Your eyes tell you that the woman in front of you looks like your wife. Your memory tells you her name and your history together. But something that has accompanied that face for decades is suddenly weakened. The experience does not feel right. The face looks right. You know who it is. But the usual feeling of familiarity does not arrive. Something feels wrong even though you cannot explain why. In some cases, that contradiction may lead a person to believe that the familiar-looking individual is an impostor. But the strange feeling may not be the whole explanation. Some researchers think that there may also be difficulty questioning or rejecting that belief once it forms. This is still, of course, only one model, and it of course does not explain every case. Tests involving patient JH showed how specific the problem could be. He struggled when familiar people were presented through their faces or voices, but when he saw their names written down, his recognition of them was much stronger. This suggests that he had not lost everything he knew about those people. The information was still there, the names were still familiar. But seeing their faces or hearing their voices did not produce the same bodily response he expected. At this point, we need to draw a clear line between the horror metaphor and the people who live with this condition. Capgras delusion does not mean that someone has become a monster, and the patient is not the monster either. For patients and families, this is a real experience involving confusion, distress, and damaged trust. Folklore imagine an outside force replacing someone we love. Capgras represents a different tragedy. The loved one may not have changed at all. What has changed is the person's experience of recognition and familiarity. Today, medicine tries to understand such experiences through the study of perception, memory, and belief. But the fictional fear of the imposter has not disappeared. Rather, it has entered another medium, one built from old videotapes, emergency broadcasts, and faces distorted by failing screens. Analog horror is a form of online storytelling that borrows the appearance of outdated media. VHS recordings, public service announcements, local television broadcasts, and children's programs that seem harmless until something enters the signal. These stories are distributed, discussed, and expanded online. Audiences analyze individual frames, debate hidden meanings, and sometimes help establish the unwritten rules surrounding the threat. In that sense, analog horror can behave like a form of digital folklore. One influential example is Local 58. Its fictional broadcasts begin with ordinary television formats before the signal is interrupted by something hostile. A weather alert becomes a struggle over whether viewers should look outside. The authority of the broadcast can no longer be trusted. That is one reason analog horror works so well. It corrupts familiar objects. A television set once represented information, entertainment, or background noise in a safe home. Now the screen may be lying. The emergency message may be coming from the danger itself. The fear of human imitation becomes central in the Mandela catalog. Its fictional alternates imitate human forms and use familiar media to enter ordinary homes and communities. The threat is not merely that a creature is outside the door. The threat is that it may already have the correct face and inside your home. These fictional creatures should not be described as clinical representations of Capgras, nor should we claim that their creators built them from medical research. The connection is thematic. Analog horror echoes related fears of imitation, replacement, and familiar things becoming untrustworthy. The ancient god could borrow your appearance. The changeling could occupy the place of someone who had been taken. The fetch could appear in your shape as an omen. The literary double could embody the part of yourself you could not escape. The digital mimic enters through the screen. Each belongs to a different context, but all of them challenge the same assumption: that appearance is proof of identity. The imposter has taken many forms in human storytelling. A god in disguise, a supernatural substitute, a spectral omen, a guilty conscience walking on two legs, a face emerging from corrupted video. These are all cultural stories, ways of exploring fear, trust, and identity. Capgras delusion is different. It is a real clinical experience arriving from complex changes in recognition, familiarity, and belief. It should not be placed in the same category as a fictional monster, but studying it reveals something quietly unsettling. Recognizing someone we love is not one simple act. It depends upon perception, memory, emotion, and belief arriving together. Usually, this happens so effortlessly that we never notice it. You do not consciously measure your partner's face every morning. You do not compare their voice against a mental recording. You simply know them. The feeling is immediate, and perhaps that is the real reason doubles remain frightening. They expose how much of identity depends not only on what we see, but on what we feel when we see it. A copy can reproduce a face, it can imitate a voice, it can repeat a memory. But the stories of impostors ask whether any of those things are enough. The people we love are connected to us through delicate networks of recognition, memory, and familiarity. Most of the time, those systems work silently. We rarely think about them. We notice their value only when the connection is lost. And in that moment, the most familiar face in the world can become the face of a stranger. Thank you for exploring with the Elias Hart Chronicles. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Until next time, stay curious, don't die. See you next episode. Bye-bye.